Zoe and Cheryan in 2017 explained that in the United States, white people are seen as superior, while black people have been seen as inferior. This racial hierarchy has been the basis of race relations in the United States. In more recent history, the United States has seen more diversity, with Latino and Asians being the biggest racial groups, and with these groups' integration, the previous racial hierarchy framework needed to change to include them. Zoe and Cheryan propose the racial position model show that there are two dimensions or measurements of disadvantages minorities face: perceived inferiority and perceived foreignness. Zoe and Cheryan explain each different race group has different experiences regarding racial prejudice and stereotypes. These four racial groups fall into a quadrant. Whites are seen as superior and American, blacks are perceived as inferior and American, Asians are seen as superior and foreign, while Latinx are seen as both inferior and foreign. Study 1 sought to answer: does the racial position model predict real world experiences with racial prejudice? African American, white, Latino, and Asian participants were asked to describe a recent experience of racial prejudice through an open-ended question. Their responses were then coded for the following categories: inferior, foreign, superior, American, incompetent, cold, competent, warm, and no experience. They found that most participants were put into at least one category, and that two different race groups can experience different kinds of prejudices. African Americans were rated as inferior and most racially profiled and more likely to endure prejudice. Latinos were rated inferior and foreign due to incidents indicating prejudice among economic status and language barriers. Asians were seen as foreign because racial slurs they experience, but also inferior due to stereotypes such as their physical looks, yet were thought to be more superior than Latinos and African Americans. Whites received no experience because they didn't feel like they faced racial inequality.
Study 2 asks the question: are the dimensions of perceived inferiority and foreignness distinct? Researchers Zhao and Cheryan have examined over 1,000 participants to find their answer. They gave a list of racial terms and rated these terms by inferior, foreign, superior, American, incompetent, coldness, competent, and warmness. Each of the participants rated their experience on stereotypes and how many times it happens. The results show that African Americans were on the prejudice level of inferiority, for Asians and Latinx were on the prejudice level of foreignness, and the study found that whites did not experience any level of prejudice.
In the third study, researchers were trying to investigate that stereotypes are not just in the heads of the target group, but perpetuated in American society. The four racial groups rated the prevalent stereotypes with the according targeted race as listed in their questionnaire. According to the results, each race characterized themselves approximately along the dimensions they are hypothesized to be in, with some minor differences. These differences manifested in an overlap between groups in relation to the stereotypes they were each paired with. For example, the data showed that African Americans and Latinos were placed similarly on the inferiority spectrum, but the only difference between them is that the Latino stereotypes dealt more with their foreign dimension. Due to these differences, the two dimensions within the study were uncorrelated, since it focused mainly on stereotypes about groups rather than the groups themselves. The fourth study focused on exploring the positions of gender as well as Native Americans and Arab Americans along these dimensions. The experiment ran 4 identical versions of their study while collecting data from the 4 main racial groups. According to the results, males and females were placed similarly with the generic racial group along the 2 dimensions. The only difference is that within the female subgroup, Asian American women were placed as more superior than African American women. With the additional racial groups, Arab Americans were considered to be the most inferior and the most foreign. Native Americans were considered less foreign compared to Latinos and Asian Americans. However, they were considered more foreign compared to African Americans and white Americans, which demonstrates that foreignness is not defined as being foreign-born, but how well you fit within the American prototype.
Now, each study presents some limitations that should be looked into for further research. For example, in Study 1, researchers should look into including all races and sub-race groups that were not included in the original study. In Study 2, researchers should touch upon how each of the participants express how they experience hurtful prejudice. In Study 3, what should be looked into next is what was each of the participants' living situation during the experiment, while also including subgroups and stereotypes that were also left out of the original experiment. Study 4 should go deeper into how racism affected each race psychologically and emotionally to fully understand what each participant has gone through. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.